mentioned by name was the one at Fredericktown with Brother Brandon preaching there. That is a significant meeting because that's the reason you got stuck with me. But we'll try and make through anyway. But I believe it was sometime last year when we spent a Sunday evening looking at the book of Judges. And as helpful as it is as an example of what not to do, Judges can be pretty challenging and sometimes downright unpleasant to read. And so I figured that was so much fun that why don't we just jump into Ecclesiastes 2? And that's another one that can be, it can be challenging. It can be kind of depressing to read sometimes, but I don't think it has to be. But Ecclesiastes is a book which is built around the seemingly rhetorical question of, well, what's the point? What's the point of it all? And it's a book that has traditionally elicited groans when somebody might mention it in running for maybe a Bible class topic to study each week for a quarter. And read through chapter 1, where the preacher, who's the central kind of character in this book, he picks out a quality of life that is admired almost universally and everybody aspires to. And he says, no, it's just vanity. It's just striving after the wind. Crushes everybody's hopes and dreams that's reading it. And then there's chapter 2, where he picks out a couple other qualities that are rightfully admired and says, no, they're all vanity too. And of course there's chapter 5, where he picks out a quality. Well, you get the picture. It's a lot of downers. And, everything is pointless. And it's kind of hard to read sometimes, but I don't think, as I said, it has to be that way. Allow me to demonstrate. So about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, I saw a movie called The Village. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I'm not going to spoil it if you haven't. And it was about a small community. It was set somewhere deep in the woods, and judging from the technology they were using and the clothes that the villagers wore maybe sometime in the 19th century. And throughout the movie, the elders of this village warned the young ones about the dangers of the towns and the ferocious wolves that roamed the forest outside the safe confines of this village. And of course, as movies go, about 3/4 of the way through, an emergency arises, which causes one of the young ones in the village to have to go to the towns and this mysterious place. Well, along the way, she starts to unravel the truth about her parents and about her village and about her whole young life. And finally, when she gets to where she's going, something happens to completely change everything and to explain all the weird stuff that's been going on the entire movie that just doesn't make any sense. Now it makes sense. Now this movie was written by a man named M. Night Shyamalan, who kind of had this as his trademark at the time. He made several popular movies that revolved around a small cast of characters, and they were pitted against some kind of vague but sinister threat. And they were usually set in a setting where something just wasn't right, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. And then toward the end of the movie, something would happen to blow your mind and make everything make sense. Well, I've said all that to say this. Much like these movies, the 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes that we spend, 11 and a half really, that we spend recoiling and saying, what was Solomon thinking? Work to make that last minute kind of reveal that much more impactful and that much more powerful to us. So now that we can rest assured that there will be an answer to the question asked by this book, I want to go back and look at some of the lessons we can learn from it. I want to look through this story that really is just a beautiful composition about the true meaning of life. So if you haven't already, you want to go ahead and make your way over to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, where we'll read there in a moment. Now, Ecclesiastes, as I've kind of alluded to already, is commonly attributed to Solomon. Now there's some language in the book that makes some scholars question whether this book was written by Solomon or whether it was written by someone presenting it as a way to learn from the story of Solomon. So, and part of that is that you've got this main character, the preacher. Most of the book is written from the point of view of the preacher. He describes himself as the son of David, as king of Israel in Jerusalem, but it's bookended by another voice, kind of the narrator, the curator of this book, and who talks about the preacher. So it's pretty evident when we look, or at least seems to stick out to me when we look through the text, everything that's about the preacher, everything that he talks about, his point of view and the resources that he had and who he was, screams this is talking about the story of Solomon in one way or another. So you'll hear a lot of that name in this lesson. Now Solomon was not only the king of the United Kingdom of Israel, he was the son of David. David, of course, a man that was used throughout the Old Testament as kind of the unofficial measure of what a good and righteous king was. Whenever they had a king that was pretty good, they might say something, they might say something like, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not according to all that his father David had done. But the other thing about Solomon, of course, I think we've talked about this here before, is the fact that he was, not a small thing, granted by God to be the wisest person on earth. And so what we see in Ecclesiastes is the fact that we can see from the context here that Solomon had kind of used this wisdom and power. Well, actually we can see before this, I'm sorry. Getting ahead of myself. Solomon used his wisdom and his power that he got from being king and from God to enrich the kingdom of Israel, to build the temple of God, to enrich himself to a large degree as well. And what we have is Solomon, or at least the preacher here, using all of his vast resources to go on this quest for true fulfillment and try and find out what it is that really matters. What's the point of it all? What's this true meaning of life that will cause me to have a truly fulfilled, satisfied life? Well, what follows in Ecclesiastes is kind of a findings report of his quest. And we'll begin at chapter 1, we're after there we go. We're after identifying who the preacher is as the king of Israel in Jerusalem, the son of David. We're given kind of an overview of this research that he conducted, the results of this. And it says in verse 2 of chapter 1, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run into the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Now, when we look at this, right from the start, it's kind of looking like the success of this quest is not too promising, right? It's difficult to read this bit of poetry without some kind of dejection and maybe a bit of a pout. You know, you look at this and the sun rises, the sun goes down, the wind blows to the south, the wind blows around to the north. All things are full of weariness. There's nothing new. Talk about your first world problems. This guy had it all. Had everything. Yet he was still not satisfied. But I think that it's not like a lot of people we look at and go, wow, this guy's got maybe a celebrity that's complaining about politics or something. You go, this guy's got everything. Why isn't he happy? I think the writer here has some legitimate reasons. And so let's take a look further to see why. After giving this overview, Solomon goes on to break down his research into sections. And he starts out with wisdom. Now, he had a lot that he knew about this particular subject. He was, in fact, as we talked about, given by God to be the wisest man on earth. It's something that he wrote beautifully about in Proverbs, and actually in another part of this book as well. Yet here in chapter 1, and in verse 16, he says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were in Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now, we start to see a theme in the book regarding the resources of the preacher. He had a lot of them. In verse 16, we read that he had great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before. Now, Solomon definitely fits this descriptor. When it comes to someone with a lot of wisdom and knowledge, we're not just talking about a guy who yearned for knowledge and had almost unlimited resources and amassed a library, we'll say, full of the world's greatest works. Oh, no. No, there were those guys around. But those guys had sections they had Solomon sections in their libraries, because that's who this guy was. He was the next level up. And he had not only all the knowledge, this knowledge, but he had the wisdom to be able to use it. So, to be able to make it all make sense. But satisfaction still eluded him. You ever know anybody like that? You ever met anybody like that? That just someone who just seemed to have all the answers. Someone who could seemingly solve everybody's problems, but their own. The preacher was most assuredly someone like that. Indeed, if knowledge is our goal, if the quest to be the smartest person in the room, or just to know everything there is, well, we're going to be really disappointed. Because I'm sure you've noticed before, you've probably experienced this, the more that you find out, the more that you know, well, the more questions that arise. And after a while, it may start to look an awful lot like striving after wind. Striving after that vapor of smoke that is there for a moment and then gone, that is uncatchable. Well, unsatisfied with the storing up of wisdom, the preacher moves on in his quest for fulfillment. How about pleasures? If wisdom brings only vexation, then, and if the quest for answers only leads to more questions, then surely the answer is to simply enjoy the time that we have. Solomon is one that had been given a great deal of resources. And he was king of a great empire. He commanded a navy to bring in food and drink and building supplies and anything else he could ever want. Why not use it? So he did. And we read continuing in chapter 2 that he did just that. We'll see kind of some of the results of that. This one's a little bit more lengthy, but I think we'll get some good out of it. It says in verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched my heart to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guided me with wisdom. And how to lay hold on folly till I might see what is good for the children of man to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them with all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Now, I think it's important to realize that Solomon that came on the scene with all of this stuff. Talks about increasing his wealth, but this toil that we keep seeing in this passage, if you notice, it's not necessarily referring to the toil of getting great wealth. It's the toil of enjoying great wealth and using it. He said he had so much resources, so much money, so much stuff, that it was a job in and of itself just to use and enjoy it all. And when we think about it, well, it's kind of out of the realm of sanity, of reason right there. But tell me you never dreamed of it, right? Wealth without the toil of getting wealth, whether it be the lottery or an inheritance from a rich uncle, maybe striking oil in the backyard like Jake Clampett, or I don't know if there's many of us that haven't sat back and thought when the big numbers come on the news, the lottery's hit this, I go out and do it. But to sit back and say, boy, if I had all that money, here's what I'd do. I was having a conversation with a coworker the other day. We were talking about land and houses and what we liked and things, and he said, well, if I won the proverbial lottery, that's the only time I'd want to get a large amount of land, because then I could hire a crew of people to take care of it, because I hate yard work. Of course, my response was, well, I don't think so. I think I'd buy all the land that I could. I wouldn't need a crew to manicure it. It could just stay in forests and fields and whatever it is, and I might not ever set foot on it, but I'll know it's there, and I'll know it's mine. And you think, well, that's kind of silly. But I will say, okay. But everybody has their thing. What would you do? Would you travel? Would you cover yourself with the finest clothes? Would you buy a sports team and maybe watch your club win the Super Bowl or the World Series from your own private box? Maybe a warehouse-like garage full of Mustangs and Camaros and Roadrunners. Maybe a Ferrari or a Rolls or two for when you're feeling fancy. Personally, I've always thought an island would be really cool. Okay, we're getting a bit far afield, but it's enjoyable sometimes to sit back and just think, what if? Then comes the writer here and breaks into our pleasant dreams and says, nope, been there, done that. It's not even worth the effort. Well, why? Why would he say this? We can see when we continue on in the book. If you go, to chapter 3 and verse 18, we skip over to slightly to that part of the book. He says, I've set in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from dust, and to dust all return. In other words, just like the words on a t-shirt that I used to see a lot when I was in high school, he who dies with the most toys still dies, is kind of what the preacher is saying here. That we're all going to the same end, so all that fun in the sun, all that enjoyment is going to come to an end, and somebody else, as mentioned later on in the book, somebody else who probably doesn't deserve it is going to get all my stuff, is going to enjoy all my fun, and I'm not even going to be here. And basically the idea is, how can I be fulfilled and enjoy all this stuff when I know it's just a fleeting thing? Well, all right, so all that over-the-top lavishness is vanity. I can buy that. how about some moderation? What about just living sensibly, living wisely, being smart about things, not too over the top or anything? Well, Solomon tried this. The writer speaks here, he tried this. Was he successful? Well, kind of. He was able to do this. So let's read about these results. We go back to chapter 2. And in verse 13 it says, "Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head." When I first read that, that's kind of a funny phrase. You think, well, let's hope he has his eyes in his head. But we kind of do the same thing, don't we? That guy's really got his head on straight. Of course he does. But you know what it means. Somebody is grounded, is reasonable, knows what's going on. Kind of the idea here, I believe. But the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. Well, yes. He was able to pull off, this idea of living wisely. Or of doing what we think of, maybe not necessarily just morally, but just wisely in life. He did the right thing, not running off into foolishness and excess. But he concludes that even this is vanity, is striving after the wind. And so it goes, chapter after chapter, bemoaning the fact that no matter what we do, no matter how we live, and how we're known in this life, it's all going to end someday, and years from now, no one will even remember you existed, so what's the point in even trying? And this is the point where you start to realize why someone would groan when considering this is a topic for a class. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine it, or maybe you've been subjected to this, but if you wanted to actually sit down every week for a quarter and just look at one chapter at a time, and we'll study that verse by verse, I think by chapter 5 you probably need counseling. But fear not, because long about chapter 5, we start to get some glimpses of what may be the solution. Throughout the first half of that chapter, the preacher talks about making a vow to God and to always be sure to fulfill it. In verse 7, he concludes that it is imperative to do so when he says in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 7, "For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear." Now, did you notice something there? I know that we haven't gone through and read every verse in this book so far, but this is one of the first times in this book that there is mentioned, or at least hinted at, something outside of our everyday existence. If we flip forward to chapter 8, we see another glimpse of something more. After seemingly again lamenting the fact that sinners can prosper and that good and wise people can not prosper, in verse 12 he says, "Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God." The preacher here acknowledges that doing good may not be rewarded right now. Maybe not even in this life, but it will still be rewarded. It's finally about this time, at least for me. It might have been much earlier for me. I take a little longer sometimes, that a light bulb starts to come on. Because it's so easy to read through 98% of this book and think, well, okay, everything is pointless, why even try? And then lump every good thing that we can think of to do into that everything, be it helping others, or following God's Word, or being involved in the church and the work that goes on. But the message so far has been much more qualified. It's been much more conditional than that. In the first 98% of this book, what we've been told is that everything this world has to offer is pointless and a vapor and ends in death, so why even try? Think about that again. I've got it bolded and underlined in my notes. Everything this world has to offer. And you think about it, that's what he's talked about so far. Everything that we can see and touch and smell and enjoy and feel here on earth. And it's true. Everywhere else that we read in the Bible agrees with this 100%. We can go all the way up to 1 John in the New Testament. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, where John does in 3 verses what is done in 13 or 12 chapters rather in Ecclesiastes, and makes this point. He says, "Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, and the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world," this is the kicker, "the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." Whoever does the will of God abides forever. There you have it. Because just like John ends his 3-verse passage with a but, Ecclesiastes ends the same way, with that same but. And if we look at chapter 12, and the very last 2 verses of this entire book, we finally get to the point where you can stop and go, where was this 6 chapters ago? But it's the impact of this. The narrator finally takes over again, and we begin to hear about the preacher instead of from him. And finally, in the last words of the entire work, we are told the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes, in all of its doom and gloom and talk of unfairness and vanity and striving after the wind, is a perfectly depressing picture of what it is like to try and win at worldliness. It's what it's like to have short-term goals. Whereas John here is talking about long-term goals when he talks in 1 John chapter 2. Think of it this way. Any good thing that I might think to do, any good thing that I might think to do here for myself, kind of falls into that first category. So, if I had, we'll say, let's extrapolate it out. Let's make it ridiculous. I've got a 40-year plan to meet my goals. And kind of like politics, so I'm going to start out running for township trustee. And I figure once I get in there, that there's a certain guy that's in the township trustees for my township that is kind of in with the county commissioners. Maybe I can figure out a way to get in good with him and end up running for county commissioner. I could get county commissioner and then work my way up. And I got my 40 years all marked out. I'm at governor at year 32, and finally, year 40 is when I'll be elected to president of the United States. And I got this, when I have this 40-year plan laid out, you know what I got? I got a short-term plan, a really short-term plan. Because I'm only seeing what Paul so rightly calls those temporary things in front of me. I'm planning for this place where I'm at. Not for how long I will be around. Because it's going to be one place or another. But we have eternity to look forward to. Any kind of long-term plan is going to be a whole lot longer than our short stay on this earth. And that, I think, is what we can learn from reading through Ecclesiastes. You want fulfillment? You want your life to fill what should be its true purpose? Fear God and keep his commandments. Or as our Savior exhorted, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. This is what matters. This is what will fulfill our purpose. Fear God, because why are we here? We're here to bring Him glory. We're here to go and live with Him someday. We're here to help as many people come with us as we possibly can. We're here to fight for His cause. If there's anyone tonight, if you are lacking in any way when it comes to what really matters, whether it is that you need to follow Him better, or to come back to Him, or to give Him your life this morning because you haven't, we would absolutely love to help you do that and ask you to come forward as we stand and sing our invitation song.
And thine affections been nailed to